There are moments in life that change everything in the blink of an eye. 1 second, everything is fine, and the next, your world is turned upside down. Claire Dawson never imagined that taking her daughter to church that morning would be the last time she would see her. The search, the unanswered questions, and the agonizing emptiness consumed her. But something inside told her that Emily was still out there. Years later, an old police officer notices something unusual at a Walmart. Just a simple wave from a little girl. A wave that sets off every alarm in his mind. Could it be? What if the past was never truly buried? What if the truth had been right in front of them all along? Get ready for a story filled with mystery, emotional turmoil, and shocking twists that will leave you breathless. Stay until the end because nothing is as it seems. Subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The morning sun filtered through the white lace curtains of the Dawson household, casting soft golden light onto the wooden floors. It was supposed to be a peaceful Sunday, the kind of morning where Claire Dawson could sip her coffee in silence before the chaos of the day began. But today was different. Today, she had to get Emily ready for church, and for some reason, her 8-year-old daughter had been particularly quiet. "Emily, sweetheart, you need to finish your breakfast," Claire called from the kitchen, stirring cream into her coffee absent-mindedly. Emily sat at the small wooden table, pushing a spoon around in her bowl of cereal, barely eating. Her long blonde hair fell over her small shoulders as she stared down, lost in thought. Claire frowned. This wasn't like her daughter. Emily was usually chatty in the mornings, filling the air with endless stories about school, her friends, or the latest book she was obsessed with. "Are you feeling okay, honey?" Claire asked, walking over and crouching next to her. Emily hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, just thinking." Claire smiled and tucked a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. "About what?" Emily bit her lip and looked up at her mother with those big blue eyes. Eyes that always seemed to hold more emotion than any child her age should carry. "Do you ever feel like something bad is going to happen, even if you don't know what it is?" The question sent an unexpected chill down Claire's spine. She tried to shake off the feeling, forcing a reassuring smile. "No, sweetheart. Nothing bad is going to happen. Everything is fine." Emily didn't look convinced, but she nodded anyway. Claire kissed her forehead. "Finish eating, and then we'll get you dressed. Okay?" By the time they arrived at St. Mary's Church, the service was already starting. Claire led Emily inside, exchanging pleasantries with some of the other churchgoers. The grand hall smelled of polished wood and faint incense, the light from the stained glass windows creating colorful patterns on the floor. Emily squeezed her mother's hand tightly as they made their way to a pew near the middle. Everything seemed normal at first. The choir sang softly in the background, and the pastor stood at the altar, beginning his sermon. Claire glanced down at Emily, who had that same distant look in her eyes. "Do you need to go to the restroom before the service starts?" Claire whispered. Emily hesitated before nodding. "I'll be right back." Claire watched as her daughter walked down the aisle and slipped through the large wooden doors at the back of the church. She wasn't worried. The restroom was just a short walk away, and Emily had gone alone plenty of times before. But minutes passed, then more. Claire checked her watch. 10 minutes. That was too long. A strange sense of unease crept into her chest. She stood up, whispering to a nearby friend that she'd be right back, and made her way to the back of the church. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the hallway. It was empty, too quiet. "Emily?" Claire called softly, walking toward the restroom. The door was slightly ajar. She stepped inside. Empty. Panic started to rise in her throat. She checked the stalls one by one, hoping, praying, that Emily was just hiding or playing some kind of game. But there was no sign of her. Her heartbeat quickened as she rushed back into the hallway. "Emily? Sweetheart, where are you?" A few people turned to look, sensing the alarm in her voice. Claire ran back to the main hall, her breathing uneven. "Did Emily come back in here?" she asked the woman sitting next to her. The woman shook her head. "No, I didn't see her." Claire felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. This wasn't right. Emily wouldn't have just wandered off. She turned back toward the hallway, now running. She checked every possible place, near the Sunday school classrooms, outside by the small church garden, even the parking lot. Nothing. Emily! Claire screamed now, her voice echoing off the church walls. More people took notice. The pastor paused mid-sermon. Murmurs filled the air. Claire, what's wrong? It's Emily. Her voice broke. She's gone. A flurry of movement followed. People began searching the premises, calling out for Emily. The church doors were thrown open, people running in different directions. Claire's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. My daughter. She's missing. Hours passed, then days, then weeks. The town of Maplewood turned into a sea of missing posters. Every telephone pole, every grocery store window bore Emily's face. Claire barely ate, barely slept. She spent every moment retracing steps, knocking on doors, calling anyone who might have seen something. But no one had. It was as if Emily had vanished into thin air. Then, 2 weeks later, Claire received a letter in the mail. No return address. No handwriting she recognized. She tore it open with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the message inside. Stop looking. She's gone. The paper slipped from her fingers. For the first time since Emily disappeared, Claire collapsed onto the floor and sobbed. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, an old man sat at his worn-out kitchen table, staring at an old newspaper clipping. Walter Briggs had been a police officer for over 40 years before retiring. But some cases never left him, and something about Emily Dawson's disappearance felt familiar. He glanced at the article again. A missing girl. Blonde hair. Blue eyes. Taken without a trace. His old, tired heart pounded in his chest as he flipped through his old case files. And then he saw it. An unsolved case from 20 years ago. A little girl, who looked almost exactly like Emily, had vanished under nearly identical circumstances. Walter sat back in his chair, gripping the paper tightly. He had spent his whole life chasing ghosts. But maybe this time he had finally found something real. Walter Briggs sat in his dimly lit living room, the soft hum of the television barely breaking the silence. The old detective had spent years chasing leads, solving cases, and putting the pieces together where others had failed. But retirement had been nothing but an unbearable void, a constant reminder that he was no longer useful. His wife, Linda, had told him countless times that it was time to let go of the past, time to put his badge down and enjoy the years he had left. But Walter couldn't. Not when cases like Emily Dawson's still haunted him. Not when he knew something was off. He picked up the old case file from 2 decades ago, the edges of the paper worn from years of handling. The missing girl, a child whose face had been plastered all over newspapers back in the day, bore an eerie resemblance to Emily. The same delicate features, the same golden hair and piercing blue eyes. She had disappeared from a small church gathering in a town not far from Maplewood, under nearly identical circumstances. Walter traced his fingers over the photo, a familiar weight settling in his chest. "You're obsessing again," Linda muttered from the kitchen, her tone sharp as she dried a plate. Walter didn't look up. "And if I am? You're not a cop anymore, Walter. It's not your job to fix this." He exhaled sharply. "Someone has to. That little girl's mother is out there, breaking apart piece by piece, and no one's doing a damn thing about it." Linda scoffed. "And what do you think you can do? You're an old man, Walter. You don't have a badge, you don't have authority, and you sure as hell don't have the energy to chase ghosts anymore." Walter clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the paper. "Emily's case is just like the one from 20 years ago, Linda. The same method, the same eerie silence after. The cops aren't connecting the dots, but I see it. I know I do." His wife sighed heavily, placing the plate down with a loud clatter. "And what if you do? What if it's the same person? Then what? You barge in, demand answers? You're going to get yourself hurt, Walter, or worse. You're going to hurt that mother by giving her false hope." Walter didn't answer. He couldn't, because he knew Linda was half right. He had nothing but a hunch, a gut feeling that the police had overlooked something, that Emily wasn't just another missing child case. But hunches weren't enough. He needed proof. The next morning, Walter drove into town, pulling into the local diner where cops still gathered for their morning coffee. He walked inside, the bell above the door jingling as he entered. The place hadn't changed much in years. Same booths, same smell of burnt coffee and grease, the same group of officers sitting at the corner table. He spotted Detective Hall immediately, a younger cop, early 40s but sharp. Hall had been one of the lead detectives on Emily Dawson's case, and if Walter was going to get any information, it had to be from him. "Briggs," Hall greeted, looking up from his coffee. "Didn't think we'd see you here this early." Walter sat across from him without asking, ignoring the wary glances from the other officers at the table. "I need to talk to you about the Dawson case." Hall sighed, rubbing his temple. "Walter, come on. You know I can't discuss an open investigation." "Then don't. Just tell me if you found anything." Hall hesitated, exchanging a quick look with one of his colleagues. That was all Walter needed. "You haven't," Walter said, leaning back. "She's been gone for weeks, and you still don't have a damn clue where she is. Do you?" Hall's jaw tightened. "We're doing everything we can." "You're not connecting the dots," Walter pressed. "There was a case 20 years ago. Same town, same circumstances. A little girl vanished, just like Emily, and was never found." Hall sighed, pushing his coffee aside. "Walter, do you know how many missing children cases we get a year? 100. Maybe more. And yeah, some look similar, but that doesn't mean they're connected." "But what if they are?" Walter's voice was low, firm. "What if this isn't random? What if someone's been doing this for years?" Hall didn't answer right away. Instead, he exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "I get it. I do. But unless you have something concrete, I can't go chasing ghosts." Walter studied him for a moment, then reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded newspaper clipping. He slid it across the table. "Then take a look at this and tell me that girl isn't the spitting image of Emily Dawson." Hall hesitated before picking up the paper. His brow furrowed as he scanned the photo, his expression shifting ever so slightly. Walter caught it, the flicker of doubt, the moment of hesitation. "Where did you get this?" Hall asked. "Does it matter?" Hall sighed, folding the paper and tucking it into his jacket. "I'll look into it." That was all Walter needed to hear. Later that afternoon, he drove to Walmart. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because something about Emily's disappearance gnawed at him in ways other cases hadn't. Maybe because he needed to clear his mind. But as he walked through the aisles, his eyes scanning the shelves without really seeing them, something caught his attention. A little girl, blonde hair, blue eyes. She was walking beside a man, holding his hand. She couldn't have been older than 8 or 9. Walter wouldn't have thought twice about it if it weren't for what happened next. The girl turned her head slightly, her gaze locking onto his. And then, she waved. It was small, subtle, but something about it felt wrong. Walter's gut clenched. He wasn't sure why, but every instinct in his body screamed that something wasn't right. The man led the girl toward the exit, his hand firm on her small shoulder. Walter took a step forward, then another. His heart pounded as he watched them leave. And just like that, they were gone. For the first time in years, Walter felt something he hadn't in a long time. A lead, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. Walter couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The way that little girl had waved at him in Walmart, it wasn't just a simple wave. It was hesitant, uncertain, almost like a silent cry for help. He had seen it before in the eyes of victims in the moments before they were saved or lost forever. His mind raced as he sat in his old truck, gripping the steering wheel, his heart pounding. He hadn't followed them. That was his mistake. By the time he had reached the parking lot, the man and the girl were gone. The rational part of his mind told him it was probably nothing. Just a child being polite to an old man. But the part of him that had spent decades in law enforcement, the part that had solved more cases than he could count, told him otherwise. He had to find out who that man was. That night, Walter barely slept. He sat at his kitchen table, the old case files spread out before him, a cup of cold coffee forgotten beside his elbow. He had spent years chasing leads, trying to bring closure to families. And yet, some cases never left him. Some haunted him. The case of the little girl from 20 years ago had always nagged at him, but now it felt different. Now, he felt like he was closer to something bigger than he had ever imagined. The next morning, he drove back to Walmart. He walked through the aisles slowly, scanning every face, every child with an older man, hoping he would see them again. But they were nowhere to be found. Frustrated, he made his way to the customer service desk, pulling out his old badge. It wasn't worth much now, but sometimes people still responded to authority. "I need to see the security footage from yesterday," Walter said, keeping his voice firm. The young woman behind the desk hesitated. "Sir, I can't just. It's important. I'm retired law enforcement, and I believe I saw something suspicious." She still looked unsure, but after a long pause, she nodded. "Let me check with my manager." Walter waited, tapping his fingers on the counter, his nerves stretched thin. Minutes passed before the woman returned, her expression uneasy. "I'm sorry, sir, but the footage from yesterday is gone." Walter frowned. "What do you mean, gone?" She bit her lip. There was some kind of system error. The files were corrupted overnight. "Our IT team is looking into it, but right now there's nothing to review." Walter felt a cold dread settle in his chest. A system error? Just like that? It was too convenient, too perfect. Someone had erased it. Walter left the store, his mind racing. This wasn't just a missing child case. Someone had gone through the effort of covering their tracks. Someone had made sure there was no record of that little girl being there. He needed to talk to Claire Dawson. Claire had barely left her house since Emily had disappeared. The walls felt suffocating, the silence unbearable. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Emily's face, heard her voice. The house still smelled like her shampoo, the faint scent of bubblegum chapstick she always wore. But the absence of her laughter, the emptiness of her bedroom, was too much to bear. She had tried everything. The police, the private investigators, the media. But Emily was gone, and no one had any answers, until Walter Briggs showed up at her door. Claire stared at the old man standing on her porch, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, his voice steady. "My name is Walter Briggs. I used to be a detective. I need to talk to you about your daughter." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She had heard those words before, too many times, always leading to nothing. "Do you know where she is?" Walter hesitated. "No, but I think I know where to start looking." She stepped aside, letting him in, her hands trembling. Walter glanced around the house, noticing the missing posters taped to the walls, the piles of notes and articles scattered across the dining table. She had been relentless in her search. Claire gestured for him to sit. "What do you know?" Walter exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "I saw a girl yesterday, at Walmart. Blonde hair, blue eyes, about Emily's age. She waved at me, and then she disappeared with a man." Claire's heart pounded. "Do you think it was her?" "I don't know," Walter admitted. "But here's what I do know. The security footage from that day is gone. Someone erased it." Claire swallowed hard. "You think someone took her, and they're still hiding her?" Walter nodded. "And I think they've done it before." He reached into his jacket, pulling out the old case file. He placed it on the table, flipping it open to reveal the newspaper clipping of the girl who had vanished 20 years ago. Claire's eyes widened. "She looks just like Emily," she whispered. "Same age, same circumstances," Walter said. "And she was never found." Claire's hands shook as she stared at the image. "Are you saying whoever took Emily has done this before?" "That's exactly what I'm saying." Tears welled in Claire's eyes, but she blinked them away. "Then we have to find her. We have to stop them." Walter met her gaze. "I need you to think, Claire. Is there anything at all, that seemed off before Emily disappeared? Anyone new in your life? Anything strange?" Claire thought hard, her mind racing. "No, I don't think so." She was happy. Everything was normal. But then, something flickered in her memory. A small moment. Something she had forgotten. "The church," she whispered. Walter leaned in. "What about it?" Claire swallowed. "The day she disappeared." The pastor hesitated before calling 911. "I remember because it felt strange at the time, like he was stalling." Walter's eyes darkened. Why would a pastor stall before calling the police about a missing child? Claire's stomach churned. "I don't know." Walter stood. "Then we start there." Claire took a shaky breath. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than despair. She felt hope. That night, as Claire lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind refused to rest. Emily's face, the way she used to giggle in her sleep, the way she would curl up next to her with a book, it all played in her head like a cruel loop. Then, in the silence, her phone buzzed. She sat up, heart pounding, as she reached for it. The number was blocked. With trembling fingers, she answered. She heard nothing at first, just silence. Then, a voice. "You need to stop looking." The line went dead. Claire's blood ran cold. Whoever had Emily, they knew she was getting close. Claire sat frozen in her bed, gripping her phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The voice on the other end of the line echoed in her mind like a ghostly whisper. "You need to stop looking." It was a warning, a threat, and it sent ice through her veins. She stared at the screen, hoping, praying, that the number would appear, that she could call back, demand to know who they were, where they had her daughter. But the call was blocked. There was nothing, just silence. Her chest tightened as she took in a shaky breath. Someone was watching her. Someone knew she was still searching. She had to tell Walter. Throwing the blankets off her, she rushed out of bed and grabbed her jacket. It was late, too late to be making house calls, but she didn't care. She needed to see him. She needed answers. By the time she arrived at Walter's house, the night air had turned cold, and a thin fog rolled across the quiet street. She knocked once, twice, no answer. She tried again, harder this time. Finally, she heard movement on the other side. The door creaked open, and Walter appeared, rubbing his eyes, his old robe draped over his shoulders. "Claire," he frowned. "It's almost midnight. What's going on?" Claire pushed past him, stepping inside. "Someone called me," she said, her voice shaky. "They told me to stop looking." Walter's expression darkened instantly. He shut the door behind her. "Did you recognize the voice?" "No," she admitted, pacing the small living room. It was deep, but calm, almost like they were trying to scare me, but without sounding angry. Walter exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. "They know we're getting close." Claire turned to face him. "But how? We haven't even done anything yet." Walter grabbed his old notebook from the coffee table and flipped through the pages. "You said something about the church," he murmured half to himself. "About the pastor hesitating before calling the police." Claire nodded. "Yes, at the time I didn't think much of it. I was in shock. But now I can't shake the feeling that he knew something, or that he was trying to buy time for someone else." Walter tapped his pen against the notebook. What if he wasn't buying time? What if he was waiting for instructions? Claire's stomach twisted. "From who?" Walter met her gaze. "That's what we need to find out." The next morning, they drove to St. Mary's Church. It was quiet, the usual Sunday crowd nowhere in sight. Walter parked across the street, scanning the front doors, the stained glass windows that loomed over the entrance. "Are you sure about this?" Claire asked, gripping the seatbelt. Walter nodded. "We ask questions. See how he reacts. If he's hiding something, we'll know." Claire wasn't so sure. The thought of confronting the pastor, a man she had trusted for years, sent unease crawling up her spine. But if there was even a chance that he knew something about Emily, she had to take it. They stepped inside, the scent of polished wood and old books filling the air. The church was empty except for Pastor Lewis, who was arranging hymnals near the altar. He looked up, startled. "Claire," he said, his voice warm but hesitant. "It's good to see you. And Walter, right?" From the police force. Walter nodded. Retired. Pastor Lewis smiled. What brings you both here? Claire swallowed. I wanted to ask you something. About the day Emily disappeared. The warmth in his expression faltered. Of course. I've been praying for you, Claire. For her. Claire forced herself to hold his gaze. That day, when I told you she was missing, you hesitated before calling the police. I need to know why. Pastor Lewis stiffened. I don't remember hesitating. You did, Walter said, stepping closer. And we want to know why. The pastor glanced between them, his hands gripping the hymnal tightly. I was in shock. It's not every day a child goes missing from a church. Walter narrowed his eyes. Or maybe you were waiting for someone. Pastor Lewis inhaled sharply. I don't know what you're suggesting, but I assure you, I had nothing to do with Emily's disappearance. Claire's heart pounded. Then why did someone call me last night? Telling me to stop looking? Pastor Lewis went pale. Someone called you? Claire nodded. They knew I was still searching. They knew we were getting close. The pastor shifted uncomfortably. I don't know anything about that. Walter crossed his arms. Who were you protecting that day, Pastor? Silence. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the old clock near the entrance. Pastor Lewis opened his mouth, then closed it, looking over his shoulder, as if afraid someone was listening. Finally, he sighed. There are things about this town, things that have been happening for years, he said quietly. Things that people like you shouldn't get involved in. Claire felt the room spin. What are you saying? Pastor Lewis looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. I can't help you, Claire. Please, just let it go. Walter stepped forward, his voice low. Is Emily still alive? The pastor didn't answer. Claire's breath hitched. Please, she begged. Just tell me if she's alive. Pastor Lewis exhaled, his hands trembling. I don't know where she is, he admitted. But I know she was taken for a reason. Walter's fists clenched. By who? The pastor shook his head. I can't say. Claire felt tears burn her eyes. Then tell me this. Do I still have a chance of finding her? Pastor Lewis hesitated. Then slowly he nodded. Claire's knees nearly gave out. Walter grabbed her arm, steadying her. We're done here, he muttered. As they turned to leave, Pastor Lewis called out, his voice strained. Claire, if you love your daughter, stop digging. You don't know who you're up against. Claire didn't look back. As they stepped into the sunlight, Walter exhaled sharply. He knows more than he's saying. Claire wiped at her eyes. I don't care what it takes. I'm not stopping. Walter nodded. Then neither am I. They had a lead. A small one, but a lead nonetheless. And Claire wasn't about to let it slip away. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her phone buzzed again. Blocked number. She swallowed hard and answered. This time, the voice wasn't calm. You were warned. The voice hissed. Now you're running out of time. The line went dead. Claire shivered. Whoever had Emily, they were getting desperate. Claire sat in the dim glow of her bedside lamp, her fingers curled around her phone, knuckles white. The voice still echoed in her ears, a venomous whisper threading through her thoughts. You were warned. Now you're running out of time. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. Someone was watching her. Someone knew she wasn't stopping. And now they were losing patience. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she fought the rising panic. She should be afraid, terrified even. But more than that, she was angry. Furious that these people thought they could scare her into giving up. Furious that they had taken Emily and expected her to just accept it. She tightened her grip on the phone. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The next morning, she met Walter at a small diner on the outskirts of town. It was quiet, mostly filled with older locals sipping their coffee and reading newspapers. A bell chimed softly as she stepped inside, spotting Walter in a booth near the back. He looked tired, his usual sharp eyes heavy with exhaustion. She slid into the seat across from him, gripping her cup of coffee just to keep her hands from shaking. They called again. she said, skipping the pleasantries. Walter's expression darkened. What did they say? Claire hesitated before repeating the words. Walter exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. They're getting desperate, he muttered. That means we're close to something. Claire leaned forward. The pastor knows more. I could see it in his face. He was scared. Walter nodded. He was protecting someone. And if I had to guess, it's someone high up. Claire's stomach churned. You think this is bigger than just Emily? Walter hesitated. I think this has been happening for a long time. A shiver ran down Claire's spine. Then we need to find out who's behind it. Walter pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket and slid it across the table. I did some digging last night, he said. Found a list of donors tied to St. Mary's Church. Most of them are normal, small-time businesses, local families. But one name stood out. Claire unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the list until she found it. Bradley Monroe. The name meant nothing to her. Who is he? Walter's jaw tightened. Wealthy, quiet, a lot of land under his name. But more importantly, he's been on the board of every major adoption agency in the county for the last 20 years. Claire felt the air leave her lungs. You think he's involved? Walter nodded. I don't believe in coincidences. He's been donating to the church for years, always under different organizations, different charities. And get this, there's no record of where most of those funds go. Claire clenched her fists. And what about the missing kids? Walter pulled out another paper, a grainy photocopy of an old missing persons report. This was the girl from 20 years ago, the one who went missing under the same circumstances as Emily. Claire's stomach dropped. And Walter exhaled, pushing another paper toward her. This time it was a photo of a woman, mid-20s, blonde hair, blue eyes. She was found, Walter said quietly. 10 years later, different name, different life. She had no memory of ever being taken. Claire felt a wave of nausea. What are you saying? Walter's voice was low, careful. I think they don't just take these kids. I think they erase them. Claire's heart pounded. Erase them how? Walter shook his head. New names, new families, some kind of system in place to make them disappear. But Emily, she's still young. If they're doing the same thing, she's not lost yet. Claire gripped the table. Then we need to find her before she forgets. Walter nodded. And I think I know where to start. That night, Walter parked his truck outside an old office building on the west side of town. It wasn't flashy, wasn't well known, just a small brick structure with tinted windows and no signage. Monroe's Adoption Agency. Walter had spent years learning how to break through red tape, how to get information no one wanted him to have. And tonight, he wasn't leaving without something useful. He pulled his hat lower over his head and stepped inside. The receptionist, a young woman with sharp eyes, barely looked up as he approached the desk. Can I help you? Walter forced a polite smile. I'm looking for some information on past adoptions. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. We don't disclose that kind of information. Walter nodded. Of course, but maybe you can help me with something else. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket and placed it on the desk. The woman hesitated before looking down. It was a newspaper clipping of Emily's missing person report. Her expression didn't change, but Walter caught the way her fingers twitched slightly. You sure you haven't seen her? He asked, his voice casual. The woman exhaled. I'm sorry, sir. I really can't help you. Walter leaned in just slightly. Then maybe you can tell me why a man named Bradley Monroe has been funding adoption agencies for 2 decades. Yet there's no record of where those children actually end up. The woman froze. Walter saw it, the flicker of recognition, the fear. She knew. She recovered quickly, clearing her throat. I think you should leave now. Walter didn't move. She's still alive, isn't she? The woman's eyes darted around, as if making sure no one else was watching. Then, in the quietest voice, she muttered, You need to stop asking questions. Walter felt his pulse spike. I can't do that. She swallowed hard. Then, just before turning away, she whispered, Check the Monroe estate. But if you do, don't go alone. Walter didn't need to be told twice. He walked out, his mind spinning. The Monroe estate, a place that had been off-limits for years, hidden behind iron gates and private security. If Emily was still alive, if she was somewhere within reach, that was where she would be. He pulled out his phone and dialed Claire. "We have a lead," he said the moment she answered. "But it's dangerous." Claire's voice was firm. "Tell me where to go." Walter hesitated. Then, finally, he said, "The Monroe estate." Silence. Then, Claire whispered, "Then that's where we're going." Walter nodded. "Be ready, because once we go in, there's no turning back." The Monroe estate loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the fading light of dusk. The mansion was massive, sitting on acres of private land, surrounded by tall wrought iron gates that warned outsiders to keep away. It was the kind of place where secrets could stay buried for years, the kind of place where people disappeared. Claire sat in the passenger seat of Walter's truck, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as they approached the entrance. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears, but she forced herself to stay focused. Emily was close, she could feel it. They had spent weeks chasing dead ends, questioning people who refused to talk, following leads that led nowhere. But this was different. This time they had a name, a location. This time they were walking straight into the lion's den. Walter pulled off the main road, parking just outside the estate's view. He turned to Claire, his face lined with years of experience and the weight of knowing they were about to cross a line they could never uncross. "This isn't just a house, Claire," Walter murmured, glancing at the imposing gates. "This is an empire. People like Monroe don't just run adoption agencies, they run entire networks. Whatever's happening here, it's bigger than we thought." Claire swallowed hard, gripping her jacket. "I don't care how big it is. I just want my daughter back." Walter nodded. "Then we do this carefully. We get in, find out what we can, and get out. No heroics." Claire's jaw clenched. "If I see Emily, I'm not leaving without her." Walter sighed, but he didn't argue. He knew better than anyone that a mother's instinct wasn't something you could reason with. They climbed out of the truck, moving under the cover of the trees lining the estate. The air was thick with tension, the rustling leaves the only sound between them. As they approached the high stone walls, Walter pulled out a pair of binoculars, scanning the property. "Security cameras at the front," he muttered. "2 guards at the main gate, more likely scattered around the house." Claire took a shaky breath. "How do we get in?" Walter studied the perimeter before pointing. "There, the service entrance near the garden. Less visibility, no direct cameras." Claire followed his gaze. A smaller side gate, partially obscured by overgrown ivy, sat unguarded. They moved quickly, staying low as they crossed the open stretch of land. The closer they got, the heavier Claire's chest felt. She tried not to think about what she would do if Emily wasn't here. She tried not to think about what they might find instead. Walter reached the gate first, testing the handle. Locked, but he pulled a small tool from his pocket and worked it into the mechanism, his hands steady despite his age. Within seconds, the lock clicked open. Claire exhaled. "Where did you learn how to do that?" Walter smirked. "You spend 40 years on the force, you pick up a few things." They slipped inside, careful to keep to the shadows. The estate was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made Claire's skin crawl. Expensive cars were lined up in the driveway, the glow of warm lights spilling from the mansion's large windows. "Looks like there's some kind of event," Walter murmured. Claire stiffened. "A party?" Walter nodded. "Could be cover, or could be something worse." Claire's stomach twisted. The last time she had heard Emily's name, it had been tied to a birthday party invitation. Could this be the same thing? They moved along the side of the house, pressing against the cold stone walls. As they reached one of the lower windows, Claire peeked inside. The room was lavish, decorated with gold accents and expensive furniture. Guests in elegant attire sipped wine, their conversations hushed. It looked like any other high society gathering, except for the unmistakable air of secrecy. Walter nudged her. "Come on. We need to get upstairs." Claire followed him as they crept along the edge of the house, finding a side door left slightly ajar. They slipped inside, their footsteps careful against the marble floor. The house smelled of expensive perfume and aged wood, every detail pristine and calculated. They moved through the hallways, past rooms filled with murmuring guests, until they reached a grand staircase. Walter motioned for Claire to stay behind as he climbed the first few steps, scanning for movement. "Clear," he whispered. They ascended quickly, hearts pounding, every step bringing them closer to the truth. At the top, the air felt heavier. The hallway was lined with closed doors, each one leading to an unknown room. But one door at the very end was different. It was locked. Walter pulled out his tools again, working fast. Claire's hands shook as she watched him, her pulse racing. Finally, the lock gave way with a soft click. Walter pushed the door open, and Claire's breath caught in her throat. The room was small, sterile. A simple bed, a wooden desk, a dresser. But it wasn't the furniture that made her stomach drop. It was the faint smell of lavender, Emily's favorite scent. Claire's legs nearly gave out. "She was here," she whispered, stepping inside, her fingers tracing the edge of the bed. "I can feel it." Walter scanned the room. Whoever was keeping her here, they were careful. No pictures, no personal items. But this. He reached for the closet door, opening it to reveal a row of neatly pressed dresses. Small dresses, the kind a child would wear. Claire covered her mouth, choking back a sob. They dressed her, like she belonged to them. Walter's jaw clenched. This isn't just a holding place. This is preparation. Claire turned to him. Preparation for what? Walter didn't answer, because he already knew. And then a noise. Footsteps in the hall. Claire's breath hitched. Walter moved fast, pulling her into the closet just as the door creaked open. They held their breath as a man stepped inside. Bradley Monroe. He moved with purpose, heading straight for the desk, flipping through a small notebook. Claire's hands shook with barely contained rage. He was right there, the man who had funded this entire operation, the man who had possibly taken Emily. Walter's grip on her wrist tightened, silently warning her to stay still. Then, Monroe did something strange. He picked up a small hairbrush from the desk. One Claire instantly recognized. Emily's brush. Monroe stared at it for a long moment. Then, in the softest voice, whispered, "I'm sorry." Claire's eyes widened. Walter's expression darkened. Monroe wasn't just part of the operation. He was regretting it. As soon as Monroe left the room, Walter and Claire slipped out, their minds spinning. Claire turned to Walter, her voice a breathless whisper. "Did you hear that?" Walter nodded. "He's involved, but he's not the mastermind. Someone else is pulling the strings." Claire swallowed hard. "Then we make him talk." Walter looked at her, his face grim. "And what if he won't?" Claire's eyes burned with determination. "Then we find out who will." Claire's mind was spinning as she and Walter slipped out of the room, their footsteps light against the thick carpet. Bradley Monroe's words echoed in her head. "I'm sorry." Sorry for what? For taking Emily? For keeping her here? Or was there something deeper? Something even more horrifying that they hadn't uncovered yet? Walter motioned for her to follow as they crept down the hallway, their ears tuned for any sound of approaching footsteps. The house was too quiet now, the party downstairs a distant murmur, as if the walls themselves were swallowing the noise. It made Claire's skin crawl. They needed to get out, but not before they got what they came for. Walter led them toward the back staircase, an older, less ornate set of stairs meant for servants, hidden from view. As they reached the first landing, they heard voices, low, urgent whispers coming from the room just below them. Walter pressed a finger to his lips, motioning for Claire to stay silent as they crouched against the railing, listening. "I told you we had to move faster," a man's voice hissed. "She wasn't supposed to be found." Another voice responded, quieter, more anxious. Claire's heart stopped. "They're talking about Emily." Walter glanced at her, his jaw tight. She's already bonded with them, the first man continued. If we don't finish the process soon, she'll start asking questions. Claire felt a cold wave of nausea. Finish the process? What did that mean? The second man hesitated. What if she remembers? The first voice let out a frustrated sigh. She won't. Not if we do it right. Walter tensed beside her. They were out of time. He motioned for Claire to follow as he moved toward the back entrance. The house was a maze of corridors and hidden doors, but Walter moved like he had done this 100 times before. Claire's pulse raced, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, to storm into that room and demand answers. But Walter grabbed her wrist, his grip firm. Not yet, he whispered. We need to get out first. Claire swallowed her anger, forcing herself to trust him. They reached the service entrance, slipping through the narrow doorway into the cold night air. The moment they were outside, Claire sucked in a breath, realizing she had been holding it the entire time. Walter didn't stop moving until they reached the trees at the edge of the property. Only then did he turn to face her, his expression grim. We're dealing with something much bigger than we thought, he said, voice low. Claire nodded, her throat dry. They're changing her, she whispered. They're making her forget. Walter exhaled. It's not just Emily. That's what I'm starting to realize. This has been happening for years, maybe longer. They don't just take children, they erase them. They replace their memories, their identities. And then they disappear into new lives with new families. Claire's stomach twisted. But why? What do they gain from this? Walter hesitated. I don't know yet, but we need to make Monroe talk. Claire nodded. He's the weak link. I could see it in his face. He's not like the others. Walter's eyes darkened. No, but he's still part of it. And that makes him dangerous. They drove back to town in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The weight of what they had just uncovered pressed down on Claire's chest, making it hard to breathe. Every second that passed, Emily was slipping further away. If what they had overheard was true, she might not even remember Claire soon. The thought was unbearable. Walter pulled up outside Claire's house, cutting the engine. He turned to her, his face lined with exhaustion. Get some rest. Tomorrow we go after Monroe. Claire almost laughed. Rest? How could she possibly sleep knowing her daughter was out there, trapped in a world that wanted to erase her? But she nodded anyway, pushing open the truck door. Claire. Walter's voice stopped her. She turned back. You're not alone in this, he said quietly. For the first time in weeks, she believed him. The next morning, Claire and Walter parked outside Monroe's downtown office, a sleek, modern building that looked out of place in their small town. Claire's hands shook as she gripped the coffee Walter had handed her. Are you sure he'll be here? Walter nodded. I had someone check. He comes in every morning at 8. Claire exhaled, bracing herself. And if he doesn't talk? Walter's expression hardened. Then we find another way. They waited. And sure enough, at exactly 8 o'clock, a black luxury car pulled up. Bradley Monroe stepped out, adjusting his tie, his posture stiff. He looked like a man carrying too many secrets. Walter was out of the truck before Claire could stop him. He strode across the parking lot with purpose, his badge, long expired, flashing in the morning light as if it still held power. Mr. Monroe, Walter called. Monroe froze mid-step, his eyes widening slightly before narrowing. Detective Briggs. His voice was even, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, recognition, fear. Claire stepped up beside Walter. We need to talk, she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Monroe glanced around, as if checking for witnesses. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're making a mistake. Walter crossed his arms. No, the mistake was thinking we wouldn't come after you. Monroe exhaled sharply. I have a meeting. Walter took a step closer. Then I suggest you cancel it. There was a long silence. Then, finally, Monroe nodded. Not here. He gestured toward the building. Follow me. They walked inside, the tension thick. Monroe led them to his office, a large, sterile space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He closed the door behind them, rubbing his temples. "You don't know what you're getting involved in," he muttered. Claire's patience snapped. "Where is my daughter?" Monroe flinched. "I don't know." "Liar," Walter growled. Monroe ran a hand down his face, looking exhausted. "I swear to you, I don't know where she is right now. But I can tell you this. If you don't stop, you'll never see her again." Claire's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" Monroe hesitated. Then, finally, he looked her in the eye. "You're asking the wrong questions," he said softly. "It's not about where she is. It's about who she is now." Walter's face darkened. "You erased her." Monroe swallowed hard. "Not me. But yes, it's already started. The longer she's gone, the harder it will be for her to remember. Soon, she won't know you." Claire's vision blurred with tears. "No," she whispered. "I won't let that happen." Monroe looked at her, something flickering in his gaze. Regret. Then, finally, he said, "There's an event happening tomorrow night. Private gathering. If she's still here, that's where she'll be." Claire's breath caught. "Where?" Monroe hesitated. "The Hawthorne estate. But I'm warning you, if you go, you won't walk away the same." Claire squared her shoulders. "I don't care what happens to me. I'm bringing my daughter home." Monroe exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Then I suggest you act fast." Walter nodded. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." Claire turned to Monroe, her voice shaking. "If you're lying to me—" "I'm not," he interrupted, his voice quieter now. "I don't want to be part of this anymore." Walter studied him. "Then help us." Monroe hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached into his desk and slid a small, folded piece of paper across the table. "You didn't get this from me." Walter picked it up, his eyes scanning the writing. Then his face darkened. Claire leaned in. It was an address, their next lead, and possibly their last chance. The address burned in Claire's mind like a brand, its weight heavier than anything she had carried before. The Hawthorne estate, a place she had never heard of, never had reason to know, but now it was all she could think about. If Monroe was telling the truth, Emily would be there. Her daughter, her baby, and she was running out of time. Walter drove in silence, his hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. The sun had barely set, the sky painted in deep oranges and purples, but Claire felt nothing beautiful about the evening. All she could feel was the pressure in her chest, the racing thoughts clawing at her mind. "We need a plan," Walter said finally, breaking the silence. Claire turned to him. "A plan? My plan is to walk in there and get Emily." Walter clenched his jaw. "And what happens when they stop you? What happens when they take you too?" Claire exhaled sharply, her fingers digging into her palms. She hated this, hated the waiting, the fear. But Walter was right. If they were going to do this, they had to be smart. "Tell me what you know about the Hawthorne estate," she said, trying to steady her voice. Walter kept his eyes on the road. "It's old money. Family's been around for decades, but they keep to themselves. It's not just a house, Claire. It's a compound, gated, monitored, the kind of place where people go in, but don't always come out." Claire shivered. "And this event Monroe mentioned? What is it?" Walter exhaled. "If I had to guess, an auction." Claire's breath caught in her throat. "An auction?" Walter nodded grimly. "This isn't just about taking kids. This is about owning them, placing them into specific lives, specific families. And if Emily is there, it means they haven't finalized her placement yet." Claire's stomach twisted. The idea of her daughter being sold like an object made her want to scream, to tear through the estate with her bare hands. "We don't have time," she whispered. Walter nodded. "Which is why we need to do this carefully. We're going in as guests." Claire frowned. "How?" Walter pulled a small envelope from his pocket. "Monroe gave me these invitations. Not in our names, obviously, but it'll get us through the door." Claire hesitated. "And then what?" Walter's expression darkened. "We find Emily. And we get out before they know we were ever there. Claire swallowed hard, nodding. Then let's do it. The Hawthorne estate was even more imposing than Claire had imagined. A massive, Gothic structure with tall, arched windows that flickered with candlelight. Black iron gates stood open, allowing sleek black cars to roll up the long driveway, their passengers dressed in evening wear. Claire adjusted the simple black dress Walter had found for her, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone around her would hear it. Walter, dressed in a dark suit, walked beside her, his posture calm but alert. They handed their invitations to the man at the entrance. He barely glanced at them before stepping aside. "Enjoy your evening," he said with an unsettling smile. Claire felt sick. Inside, the estate was breathtaking. Chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, casting golden light over the sea of wealthy guests. Soft classical music played in the background, and waiters in crisp white uniforms moved through the crowd, carrying trays of champagne. It all looked so normal, but Claire knew better. Walter leaned in, his voice low. "Blend in. We need to find where they're keeping the kids." Claire forced herself to smile, nodding as if she belonged there, but every fiber of her being was on edge. Then she saw him, Bradley Monroe. He stood near the grand staircase, speaking in hushed tones with a tall, silver-haired man. The moment his eyes landed on Claire and Walter, something flickered in his expression. Fear. Walter caught it too. "He knows we're here." Claire's heart pounded. "Good. Then he knows we're not leaving without Emily." They moved through the crowd, listening for anything that might give them a clue. Bits and pieces of conversation floated around them. "Such a lovely gathering this year. I heard there's a special presentation tonight. They always find the most exquisite ones, don't they?" Claire clenched her fists, biting the inside of her cheek to keep herself from reacting. Then, a chime rang through the room, a signal. The guests turned toward the staircase as a woman in a sleek black dress descended the steps, her expression cool and controlled. "Thank you all for joining us tonight," she said, her voice smooth. "As always, discretion is our highest priority. And now, if you would kindly follow me, we'll begin the evening's main event." The guests moved as one, following her through a set of heavy wooden doors. Claire's breath came in shallow bursts as she and Walter joined the procession. They stepped into a dimly lit room. Rows of elegant chairs faced a small stage, where a thick velvet curtain concealed whatever was behind it. Claire's nails dug into her palms. She didn't want to see this, didn't want to know what horrors these people indulged in. But she had to. The woman on stage smiled. "We begin with our newest acquisitions." The curtain pulled back. Claire's vision blurred. There were children, 5 of them, dressed in pristine white clothing, standing in a perfect line. Their expressions were blank, their movements robotic. And there, at the end of the line, was Emily. Claire almost collapsed. Her baby, standing there, motionless, her blue eyes vacant. Something was wrong. Walter grabbed Claire's arm before she could move. "Wait," he murmured. Tears burned in Claire's eyes. Emily was so close, but there was no recognition in her face, no flicker of familiarity. Then the woman on stage spoke. "As always, our team has ensured a seamless transition. Memories have been properly adjusted, ensuring full integration into their new lives." Claire's stomach turned to ice. "Memories have been adjusted? No. Walter's grip tightened. "She doesn't remember," he whispered. Claire shook her head. "I don't care. I'm getting her." Walter didn't stop her this time. Claire moved before she could think. She shoved past the guests, her heels clicking against the floor as she rushed forward. "Emily," she cried. The room went silent. Emily blinked, her small body stiffening. The woman on stage frowned. "Excuse me, but Emily." Claire's voice cracked. Emily's lips parted slightly. Confusion flickered in her blue eyes. Something broke inside her. "Mommy," Claire sobbed. Chaos erupted. Security lunged toward Claire. Walter moved fast, grabbing one of the men and twisting his arm back. Guests gasped, some scrambling away, others watching with sick fascination. Claire reached for Emily. "Come here, baby," she begged. Emily hesitated, her small body trembling. Then, as if something inside her clicked, she ran. Claire caught her just as security reached them. Walter roared, shoving people aside. "Move, move!" They ran. Through the halls, past the stunned guests, down the grand staircase. "Don't let them leave!" Walter fired a shot into the air. It wasn't meant to hit anyone, just to make them hesitate. It worked. They burst through the doors into the night. Walter threw Emily into the truck as Claire climbed in after her. Tires screeched. The gates loomed ahead. Walter didn't slow down. He crashed through them, metal bending as the truck sped onto the open road. Claire clutched Emily, sobbing into her hair. Emily's small hands clung to her. "Mommy," she whispered. "I remember now." Claire sobbed harder. They had her back, but it wasn't over yet. The truck roared down the empty road, headlights slicing through the darkness. Claire clutched Emily against her chest, her heart hammering, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. She could still hear the chaos behind them. The shouting, the scrambling of security, the distant wail of sirens. They weren't safe yet. Walter's hands were steady on the wheel, but his eyes flicked between the road and the rearview mirror, his jaw tight. "They're coming," he muttered. Claire swallowed hard, her grip tightening around Emily. "How far do we need to go?" Walter exhaled sharply. "Far enough." Emily trembled in her arms, her small fingers clutching the fabric of Claire's dress. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice fragile. "I don't understand. What's happening?" Claire kissed the top of her head, forcing her voice to stay calm despite the storm raging inside her. "It's okay, baby. You're safe now. I've got you." But she wasn't sure that was true. Walter took a sharp turn, the tires skidding slightly against the pavement. The adrenaline in Claire's veins was beginning to wear off, replaced by the chilling realization of what they had just done. They had stormed into one of the most powerful, secretive organizations she had ever encountered and stolen a child back from their grasp. They weren't going to just let that slide. "We need a safe house," Walter said, his voice tense. Claire looked up at him. "Do you have one?" Walter nodded, but his eyes were hard. "Yeah, an old place I used years ago, back when I was working a case off the books. No one knows about it. We can lay low there until we figure out our next move." Claire nodded. She didn't care where they went as long as it meant Emily was safe. Emily stirred against her. "I feel weird," she whispered. Claire pulled back, searching her daughter's face. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Emily's little brow furrowed. Like I remember things, but they don't feel real." Claire's throat tightened. They had done something to her. They had tried to erase her past, tried to make her forget. But she was still here. She was still Emily. "It's okay, baby," Claire whispered, brushing her hair back. "You're home now. You're with me." Emily's blue eyes flickered with something. Fear, confusion, but also a flicker of recognition. She nodded slowly, pressing herself closer into her mother's embrace. Walter took another turn, the truck bumping slightly as they veered onto a secluded dirt road. Trees loomed on either side, their branches casting eerie shadows across the path. It was a place no one would think to look. The small cabin appeared ahead, nestled between the trees, worn but sturdy. Walter parked the truck and shut off the engine. For a moment, the silence was deafening. "We need to be careful," Walter murmured. "They'll be looking for us." Claire nodded, scooping Emily into her arms as she stepped out of the truck. The ground was cold beneath her feet, the air crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. Walter unlocked the door, pushing it open to reveal a dimly lit interior. It was small, one main room with a kitchenette, a couch, and a single bedroom off to the side. But it was safe. Claire carried Emily inside, sitting down on the couch, holding her tightly. Walter locked the door behind them, double-checking the windows. "We don't have much time before they start searching this area. We need to come up with a plan." Claire looked up at him. "What kind of plan?" Walter exhaled. A way to take them down. Claire's heart pounded. She had been so focused on getting Emily back, she hadn't let herself think about what came next. But Walter was right. If they didn't do something, if they didn't stop these people, they would keep going. Keep taking children. Keep erasing lives. They have power, Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. Connections. Money. Walter nodded. Yeah, but they also have secrets. And secrets are what bring powerful people down. Emily stirred in her arms. Mommy, will they come for me? Claire felt her chest tighten. She pressed a kiss to Emily's forehead. Not if I can help it. Walter rubbed his temples, thinking, we need proof. Something we can use to expose them. Monroe helped us once, but he's too deep in this to be reliable. Claire swallowed. Then we need to find someone else. Someone who knows more. Walter nodded slowly. I might have an idea. The next morning, Walter left before dawn, promising he'd be back with information. Claire didn't like letting him go alone, but someone had to stay with Emily. She kept the cabin locked, her nerves on edge with every sound outside. Emily played quietly with an old deck of cards she had found in a drawer, her small fingers flipping them absent-mindedly. Mommy? She asked after a long silence. Claire turned to her. Yes, sweetheart. Emily hesitated. Did you ever sing to me before bed? Claire's breath caught. Yes, she whispered. Every night. Emily looked down at the cards. I think I remember that. Tears burned in Claire's eyes. Do you remember the song? Emily's lips parted slightly, her brow furrowed. And then, in the softest, most fragile voice, she sang. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. Claire broke. She pulled Emily into her arms, sobbing into her hair. She was still there. Pieces of her were still there. And Claire would fight to bring every last one of them back. Hours passed. Claire barely moved from the couch, holding Emily close, whispering to her about their life before. Her favorite bedtime stories, the way she used to splash in the bathtub, the little freckles on her nose that she always said were fairy kisses. Anything to help her remember. Then, just as the sky darkened, headlights appeared in the distance. Walter. Claire rushed to the door, unlocking it just as he stepped inside, his face tense. I found something, he said, his voice low. Claire's pulse quickened. What is it? Walter exhaled. An old police file. From years ago, one of the detectives who originally worked on a case like Emily's. He disappeared, but before he did, he left behind notes. Names. Claire's heart pounded. Who? Walter hesitated. Then finally he said it. The name at the top of the list? His voice was grim. Pastor Lewis. Claire felt the air leave her lungs. No, that couldn't be right. He told me he was scared, she stammered. That he wanted me to stop looking. Because he was part of it, Walter interrupted. He wasn't trying to warn you. He was trying to protect himself. Claire swayed on her feet. The man she had trusted. The man who had comforted her when Emily disappeared. He had been part of it the entire time. Walter's eyes darkened. He knows everything, and he's the key to bringing this whole thing down. Claire clenched her fists. Then she exhaled slowly, a cold, unwavering determination settling inside her. Then we make him talk. Claire felt the weight of Walter's words settle deep in her bones. Pastor Lewis, the man who had stood at the pulpit every Sunday, preaching about faith and family. The man who had taken her hands in his, whispering prayers for Emily's safe return. The man who had looked her in the eyes and told her to stop searching. And all this time he had known. She gripped the edge of the worn wooden table in the cabin, her mind spinning. Emily was curled up in the corner, flipping through an old book, unaware of the storm raging inside her mother. Claire forced herself to take a breath, steadying the rage bubbling beneath the surface. Walter set a thick manila folder on the table. I went through everything, he said, his voice low. Old case files, anonymous tips. This goes deeper than I ever imagined, Claire. Claire looked at him, her pulse hammering. How deep? Walter's jaw clenched. Lewis has been doing this for years, longer than we thought, and he's not just involved, he's a central piece. He's the one who chooses them. Claire's stomach twisted. Chooses? Walter nodded. These aren't random kidnappings. They're selections. Lewis picks children from his congregation, families he knows, people who trust him. He exhaled. Emily wasn't taken by accident. She was chosen. The words sent a cold wave through Claire's body. Walter flipped open the folder, pointing to a scanned document. This is from a missing child case 15 years ago. Same pattern. A little girl, same age as Emily, disappeared from church. Parents were told to stop looking. No leads. No resolution. Claire's throat tightened. And Walter turned the page. Another file. Another name. Another missing child. And another page. And another. Claire's hands trembled as she stared at the names. The dates. The faces of children who had vanished just like Emily. Her breathing became ragged. How has no one stopped him? Walter rubbed his temples. Because the people in power protect him. This network, it has influence. Money. It extends beyond Maplewood. Beyond the church. But Lewis, he's the weak link. If we get to him, we get to the rest of them. Claire swallowed, her nails digging into her palms. Then we make him talk. Walter hesitated. Claire, this isn't just about confronting him. We need proof. We need something that will take them all down. Otherwise, they'll cover this up, and we'll lose everything. Claire nodded, forcing herself to think clearly. So what do we do? Walter pulled out another document. Lewis keeps records. He has to. I guarantee there's a file on Emily somewhere. We find that, and we have evidence. Claire's mind was racing. Where would he keep them? Walter's face darkened. The church. Claire inhaled sharply. The place where it had all started. They drove in silence, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them like a suffocating fog. Claire's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. Emily was safe now, but she wouldn't truly be safe until the people who had done this were gone. Walter's voice broke the silence. We get in, we get the files, we get out. No confrontation unless absolutely necessary. Claire didn't respond, because she knew, deep down, that if she saw Lewis, she wouldn't be able to walk away without demanding answers. They pulled into the empty lot behind St. Mary's Church. The building stood tall against the dark sky, its stained glass windows glowing faintly from the dim interior lights. It looked the same as it had the day Emily disappeared. But now Claire saw it differently. Now it was a place of nightmares. Walter led the way, moving toward a side entrance. He pulled out a set of old keys and tested them against the lock. Claire frowned. How do you have those? Walter didn't look at her. You'd be surprised how many copies of church keys exist. With a soft click, the door opened. They stepped inside. The air smelled of old wood and candle wax. The silence was deafening. Claire's pulse quickened. Where would he keep them? Walter gestured toward the back. His office. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled against the carpeted floor. Walter led them down a dimly lit hallway, stopping outside a heavy wooden door. He tested the handle. Locked. Walter sighed, pulling out his tools. Give me a second. Claire glanced over her shoulder, every nerve on edge. The church was empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. Then, a soft creak. Her breath hitched. Walter, she whispered. He glanced up, frowning. What? Claire's heart pounded. We're not alone. Walter's hand hovered over the doorknob. Where? Then, from the shadows. Looking for something? Claire spun, her blood turning ice. Pastor Lewis stood at the end of the hallway, his face calm. Almost too calm. Walter straightened, slipping his tools back into his pocket. Evening, Pastor. Lewis smiled. I was wondering when you'd come. Claire clenched her fists. You knew we'd find out. Lewis tilted his head. And yet, here you are. Unprepared. Walter tensed. Where are the files? Lewis chuckled. Do you really think I'd keep them here? Claire's breath came in ragged bursts. You took my daughter. Louis sighed, as if he were disappointed. No, Claire. I saved her. Something inside Claire snapped. Saved her? Her voice echoed through the hallway. You stole her. You tried to erase her. Louis folded his hands. She was chosen, just like the others. Claire's vision blurred with rage. You ruined families. You destroyed lives. And for what? Louis's smile didn't falter. You don't understand, Claire. You never will. Walter's voice was sharp. Then make us understand. Louis studied them for a long moment. Then he exhaled. Fine. He took a step forward, lowering his voice. It's not about stealing children. It's about placing them where they belong, where they'll thrive, where they'll never suffer. Claire shook her head. You don't get to decide that. Louis's expression darkened. You think the world is kind? That every mother loves her child? That every father protects them? No, Claire. You were lucky, but most children are better off forgotten. Claire felt sick. Walter's voice was steel. And who decides that? You. Louis smirked. I was given a purpose. Claire's hands trembled. Who gave it to you? Louis didn't answer. Walter took a step closer. Where are the files, Louis? Silence. Then finally, Louis smiled. You'll never find them. Claire's pulse roared in her ears. But then, a voice from behind them. Yes, they will. Claire turned. Monroe. His face was pale, his hands shaking. I know where they are, he said. And I'm done protecting you. Louis's expression faltered for the first time. Walter smirked. Well, that's interesting. Monroe stepped forward, his jaw clenched. It's over, Louis. And Claire, for the first time since Emily disappeared, knew it was true. It was over. They had won.